Fabulous. Welcome today to Understanding Nonprofit Graphic Design Costs. What's behind the price tag? This is a webinar from the nonprofit website Insider, which is a newsletter and a series of free webinars like this about once per month. And if you go forward a slide, Lauren, this is me. In addition to doing the nonprofit website Insider, I am a coach and guide for nonprofits who are building and working on websites, everything from people who are building them themselves and just want a little bit of side help, all the way to big websites, people who are working with vendors on big projects, people who are writing content, all of that type of thing. And here is my face. And in fact, I'm going to turn myself off in the video. We're so excited to have with us today Lauren Atherton, who is the brand designer for nonprofits and the founder of HeartSpark Design. Lauren, you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Laura. This is so fun. I love getting to collaborate with a strategist. And so this is just like, anyway, this will be a nerdy session, but I'm so here for it. If we haven't met before, it's so nice to meet you. I own, found, run HeartSpark Design. And over the last 15 years, I've been in the creative industry. I've worked anywhere, everywhere from ad agencies to in-house teams to freelancing to yeah, being kind of the ace in the hole for companies that just need a designer for short-term projects, things like that. And so I actually started HeartSpark Design back in 2020 after all these years of experience and love being able to use design to help nonprofits, small to mid-sized nonprofits specifically, level up and really get the attention and kind of the alignment with their design that they deserve. And so it's really been a lot of fun for me. And I see a lot of questions about design, how, like what's included in design, how much should I pay for design, what type of platforms should I use? And so I feel like there's a lot of confusion around this topic. And I'm really looking forward to just demystifying it and just talking about all the different options available to you and the pros and cons of each. And then also, what do you get for, working with a bigger agency versus working with a freelancer versus doing it yourself? So glad you're here. Thanks for joining us today. And before we jump in, I also want to talk about obviously there are so many different types of design out there, and design exists on a spectrum. Like it's like you can DIY it and do it yourself, and that goes all the way up to award-winning work. And so that's where there's like whole festivals and conferences and award shows, and it can range from like minor projects to major projects. But also along with that, there's all these different types of design. So for the purposes of this webinar, we're not going to talk about like print design or all of the different options. We're really focused on, as I have this little arrow here, on the intersection of web and graphic design. So what graphic design pieces are most important to get right for your website, and then applying those graphic design pieces to your website. And so, I just want to clear that up. There's a lot of different what design options out there, and so we're really just focused on web design today. Um, yeah, so really, before we jump into, I also want to talk about there are a lot of myths around design, and I'm sure as if you're on this webinar, you probably the one advocating at your organization for a website refresh or for a design refresh. But it's really common to hear in nonprofits to hear about graphic design, like, does it really matter? Is it really a big deal? And here are some really helpful statistics that I like to share with clients just to talk about how design actually impacts your internal staff, and then also how people understand your organization, how donors understand your organization, and what prompts them to donate. And that really comes to life. All of those things come together on your website. And I actually have a link here to this study that was done about the quantifiable facts about graphic design and how it affects how people perceive your nonprofit, how you feel about it. And some of these stats are really revealing that 93% of nonprofits believe a strong brand has a positive impact on donor engagement. More than two-thirds of charities have a strong visual brand. They say that increases volunteer interest. 68% of nonprofits believe they're more likely to be successful as a result of investing in design and their visual brand. So it really matters how we design websites and how we approach design in a way that's collaborative with our creative partners or vendors, or if you decide to do it yourself, understanding kind of those pros and cons and the strengths and opportunities that you have within your team as well. So this is some of my favorite statistics to share on graphic design, and all this to say, graphic design is the key to connecting with people and making a positive impression. There have been studies done that when someone lands on your website, they're actually making within a half a second, making a decision about whether to stay or go on your website, which is pretty remarkable considering you can't read anything that fast. And so the hard truth is the way your nonprofit looks matters. And that's a great opportunity as well. So I don't see that as a negative. I see that as something that just gives a little bit more weight to selecting the right vendors or the right partners, or deciding to do it yourself, just depending on what growth stage you're at. So that's what we're talking about today. What are the pieces of graphic design that influence your website, and what are the costs associated with them? What are the options available to you? How do you prepare for the process in a way that can save you time and money and headaches down the road? So hopefully when you leave this session, you're excited and equipped with the stats and the tools you need to make the right decision for your organization, and kind of just know what your options are. Okay. And I also want to start because whenever I always have to take a step back and remind myself that like not everyone knows the graphic design lingo. And there's a lot of terms and a lot of phrases and a lot of words that are used in graphic design that just want to make sure that we cover before we dive into like what's included with certain vendors or consultants. So first off, just logo, and this is an important piece to have for your website, singular visual mark that represents your nonprofit. Um, a lot of times when you're working with a vendor or a consultant, they're going to ask to see like a brand guideline, your logo, your design system, all of those things. And so these are some of the assets that are helpful to have and know that you have and you can share, because they're going to base the design off of what you already have. Next up is a design system. And this is a comprehensive set of design components like fonts, colors, photography, icons, and think of them like the building blocks of your brand identity. So when you're building a website, if you have all these pieces already determined, you're a step ahead. And so to a designer, they're going to take a look at this and go, okay, I see that you've got fonts, colors, and you're actually kind of reiterating to them like, okay, you know what you're doing, you have your brand set up, how is everything consistent, what design elements do you have that we can use? And so it really is helpful to have these pieces already established, or acknowledge that you need these pieces. In some cases, a lot of the organizations that we work with at HeartSpark only have a logo, maybe a color palette, and maybe fonts. And so that's where, okay, then we see the gaps that we need to fill with stock photography or stock icons to really help bring that full brand to life. It's almost like having part of the design language to talk with. And so making sure that we know that that's a gap we have to fill.
So it's
And that,
important, I
yeah,
think, to mention on that that there are many organizations that do not have this already established. So it
yes,
is not at all unusual to not have this to give to a website designer.
yes,
And in fact, there's a lot of web projects where this won't really be discussed at all. But you need to do at least some of this stuff. You need to think about fonts a little bit. You need to think about colors a little bit in order to get through a website project with any success. So it's worthwhile thinking through how much you want that to overlap into other things and possibly use that for a design system that you might use for other things. Like how much, if you don't have it before, how much can you take the work that's been done for your website and apply it to other materials?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that, Laura. Yeah, and honestly, it's so funny, but it's not funny. And I'm sure as soon as I say this, you'll all be like, "Oh my gosh, of course." Is really having your photography organized is one of the biggest hurdles, like in preparing for a web project. And especially when you're working with a designer, they're going to ask for, okay, what photos do you have? Icons do you have? What assets do you have that we can use for the website? So one of the ways you can get ahead is by looking, and this is a daunting task, I know, is looking at your Google Drive folder or a Dropbox folder or however you're gathering photos right now, and just start organizing them by year. So it's like, okay, we only want to use photos that are 1 to 2 to maybe 3 years old. And if you don't have any photos, great point, Laura. If you don't have any photos, like it might be time to just have a photographer come by for a day or take pictures at some programs or just start thinking about like, yeah, what assets do we have that we can use for a web design? But yes, I think the more organized you can be ahead of working with the designer, the quicker your project can go, which is less of a headache for everybody.
I actually just sent, I'm sorry, I'll be very
No,
brief.
you're good.
I just sent out one of the tips in the Insider, and I'll link this to the recording as we sent out the things, was in fact about more photos. And it was about the
Yes.
idea of getting your staff in the habit of taking photos with simple phones or whatever they have, with the idea that eventually quantity makes quality. That if you
Yes.
I think a lot of nonprofits think they need a photographer and they need all this stuff, and then they end up with nothing. Well, certainly stuff is better than no stuff. So getting going there at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always advocate for like, especially in the header area on your website, using a photo of real people in your programs. And you can always supplement with stock photography, but definitely having real photos of people is assets to have. And it's good to keep a pulse on like, okay, how old is that photo? How long have we been using it? And you can use it in appeals. You can use, I mean, any photos you take can be used, reuse them over and over and over again. So it's definitely helpful to have these assets in your design toolkit. Next up is brand identity. So all of those design pieces then come together into your brand identity. So this is your overall identity, messaging to visual elements, and it's kind of how everything comes together, just like we were talking about, those assets that you can use over and over and over again. And this is actually with a client that we've worked with at HeartSpark. So this is all of their visual identity coming together. And then finally, a style guide. So a design guide explains how to use those design elements like fonts, colors, logos across all platforms. Now, this can be as complicated, multiple pages, or as simple as your team needs. In the case of Shine, they wanted a one pager. They're like, we don't need a big document to look at. We just need a one pager with links to download our logos, see our colors, fonts, and we have everything else organized. So we're good. But you can certainly have a brand guideline with 10 pages. And again, that's just another way to hand off your brand to a designer so that they understand it and they're not creating from scratch, which adds budget and time to your project. So having a guideline is super helpful. And again, it doesn't have to be super complicated. And again, unless you're looking to revamp those elements or you're like, we have a logo, but we really need to rethink our colors and our fonts, like it's okay to approach that with a web designer or with a graphic designer too. Okay, so now that we talked about design lingo and kind of all these different pieces that are included or can be included in your web design process, let's talk a little bit more about how all of these pieces come together when you work with a web designer. So first, most designers will start with a mood board or a style board. And these are visuals that communicate the tone and the style before starting your brand or web design project. This is where it's really helpful to have a brand guideline because they're basically translating what you've currently done with your design into functional website language blocks ideas. And so sometimes it's a style board like this. Sometimes we'll lay out what I call a functional mood board. That's more of like maybe how a block is designed or how a website functions or just different elements to give inspiration. And so I think there's some factors that influence style boards. And certainly the more you can prepare and like get a brand guideline together, if you want to keep your current styles, that will save a step and save time in this process of a designer kind of shooting in the dark or trying to figure it out without having all of the context. Or I think another thing that's helpful is if you've gathered some clear inspiration, some screenshots, or maybe even a Pinterest board of the new website, some websites that you like, that'll help them narrow in and get in on that design quicker. Or if there's specific functionality, if you're like, I really want a sticky navigation, I know we're going to want to feature stories on the homepage. Talking through those options with your team ahead of time is super, super helpful. And that guides the designer on, okay, thinking through all of these elements that we need to create. Okay, so after we have the style boards, then we typically go into wireframes. And so this is like the basic building blocks of your site that are laid out in writing before you get into actually applying the styles. So this is where you can actually get ahead too by thinking about, okay, what's our big brand message, our voice, our tone? And then how much do you want if you're migrating an old site, how much do you want that old site copywriting or messaging to be present on the new site? And this is where if you work with a bigger agency or hire a contractor for your website design, they'll probably offer website copywriting or another vendor to help you massage the copy, or it could be in-house. So these are all services that are available. Or if your team feels confident in that, sometimes it's helpful, but this is where I always recommend getting a second opinion or running it by your designer or a great strategist like Laura to take a look and make sure that it's structured in a way that's going to convert people to donors and inform them about your mission. So wireframes are definitely like the step before we apply design, just thinking through all the content, planning out how do we want everything to lay out on the homepage and these main pages people are going to land on. Then we convert the wireframes into design concepts. So this is where we apply the style boards and the brand style to the wireframe to bring it to life. And so again, this is where you can see like great photos that are provided by the client. And then we've applied fonts and colors and styles to help guide the eye through the page. And it really here is where this is helpful to have an expert to kind of look at this, because if you're doing it yourself, sometimes you can get caught like, I don't quite know how to apply that or make it look exactly like what I'm picturing, where a designer will show you concepts and then they're able to develop it or apply those styles to a template. So that way the final website looks and feels exactly like what you're seeing on the page. And so again, what's helpful here is if you have a brand guideline or if you have an archive of great photography to use. Otherwise, your designer's probably going to have to search for some stock photography, which could add time and budget. And then last but not least, revisions. So this is where there's revisions in every phase of these 4 phases, but really revisions is like you are an active collaborator and you have the knowledge of your organization. So it like feel free to push back on something and really provide comments if something isn't functioning as you think it should, or if there's not, like in this case, there wasn't enough contrast in these, 3 buttons that we had here. And so really this is your opportunity to be a collaborative partner in the process. Now, I will say what's helpful, what's frustrating to designers a lot of times is if there isn't a clear hierarchy of feedback. So if you've got a team or a um, advisory committee maybe for the website redesign and you're just getting all the feedback at once, it can add a lot of frustration and time and budget to not really know, okay, who's the deciding voice in this and what's the final decision. And so again, that's really helpful to determine ahead of time. okay, who's on our advisory team? Who needs to be involved in this process? And also, okay, how are we going to make decisions? How much time do we need to make decisions on the wireframes, design concepts, everything that we're seeing? So that way, it's prioritized for the designer. And it's really okay to give feedback uh, and talk about, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat, to give feedback and push back a little bit on the design. But at this point, hopefully the design, you've already seen it, and then it's really just functionality. So each phase, your designer will kind of walk you through everything that's being done. But there's definitely a level of collaboration and weigh in that your team has and active participation in the process. And so, really, I think two factors that influence the revision process specifically, the number of stakeholders, people reviewing your work, will influence the pricing and the timing. I've worked with some organizations where they have a big team and it has to go to the leadership team and it has to go to the board. So it really, they determine that before we work together, and that's fine, but it just adds to the timeline and adds to the budget because there's kind of in between revision rounds. Um, yeah. And so it's best to review the design through the lens of your nonprofit. Try not to have your personal opinion weigh in or your personal preferences. But that's definitely the process of web design before it gets to development. And then development is, applying all of the designs, making everything functional and working live. Okay.
Lauren, a
Yeah.
question. So we have two questions.
Great.
Adriana, I'm going to hold your question for the end. But Andy has an interesting question, which is, so if you have logos, fonts, colors, so you've got most of the elements of a brand guide, are there
Yep.
any tools that will help create a brand guide from that? Like, so basically to put those together to document it for a client to use it, he's asking.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sure I know there are templates in Canva, and for most of our clients, we'll build the brand guide like a one pager or even a comprehensive document in Canva. What you could do is if you have your brand kit set up in Canva, grab a brand guideline template. I'm sure there are a ton of them in Canva. And then you can essentially apply your brand styles, your brand kit to that template. And that'd be a quick way to kind of make one pretty quickly. But I also have a free brand guideline template that I'd be happy to share. But
Ooh,
yeah, so
send it
I would
out
say,
to. Yeah. Yep.
yeah, I would say Canva is probably the quickest way to go. And it doesn't have to be super complicated unless your brand has a lot of hierarchy and things to consider. Really, what's helpful is logo, fonts, colors, examples of your brand in the wild now. So like emails or newsletter emails, appeal letters, things that a designer could see to kind of pick up on those design elements and make it consistent for the website if you want to keep your current style.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Great question. Awesome. Okay, skipping ahead. Okay, so now we'll talk about design vendors. And so I'm sure you are already aware of all the options available. There are lots of different options from pre-designed templates to hiring large agencies. This is not to say one method is better than the other. This is just information that you can kind of take and make the best decision for your organization. Some options are going to be a better match for your nonprofit. And depending on your growth stage, for early phase nonprofits, I actually recommend just like getting your like a one-page website up and then really, getting the basics of your branding down, but don't invest too much time or money into it. Like just get the information up, accessible, and then you can iterate over time. And it really just depends on your project needs, the size of your team, and level of complexity. So, yeah, there's a bunch of different options. So, we're going to kind of go through them at a high level. First option, as I'm sure you're all aware, do it yourself. There are a lot of pre-designed templates out there, whether paid or free. Canva actually has some design options available. Squarespace, Wix, Showit, where you can buy a template and customize it for your organization, but it really can limit your amount of customization available or may look generic, like especially Squarespace 7.0 when it launched a few years ago, you could spot a Squarespace website from a mile away just by how it was styled, and just being familiar with the templates. So there's definitely some pros. You can get a website up really fast and actually use some of the pre-made designs to help influence your branding, and your logo, fonts, colors, your design system. But it can be yeah, it can feel kind of generic, and then it can be tough to know how to customize it without design experience.
Also, it's only a great option for smaller nonprofits who
Yeah.
don't need more sophisticated functionality in their site.
Yes.
So you're going to outgrow, if you're big and you're going to be doing a lot of stuff, you're going to outgrow one of these tools.
Yes, absolutely. And need to consider like what online donation tools or donor management systems, things like that, CRMs that you, if you want to integrate it, and may not integrate with some of these d more do-it-yourself template options. So yeah, great point, Laura.
Yeah, but they can make a really very nice looking site. It's harder to go awry and to create something massively ugly on one of these sites because they
Yeah.
put a fair amount of guardrails around trying to make you do something that makes
Yes.
sense.
Yes, that's a great point. And I will say, like, Squarespace resizes the best and gives you a lot of, like, it's going to look great on mobile and desktop. Wix, I've definitely seen some organizations go awry where it'll look okay on desktop. And then when you get to mobile, you actually have to go and move all of these elements around, drag and drop them. So they're not bad options. It's just there's some trade-offs that you have to consider with it for sure. Okay, and then hiring an external consultant firm or agency. So this is where this is just, these are general buckets. There are certainly agencies that can be less expensive or more expensive, or freelancers who can be less expensive or more expensive. And you may find a unicorn who's like, oh, this is a perfect fit for us. But really, it's helpful to know what you get when the price goes up and up and up. And so, full disclosure, HeartSpark is a small design firm and studio, branding studio. So we fit here. And so most of my perspective kind of comes from that lens, but I have been a freelancer and I've also worked with large agencies, advertising agencies, and so know the ins and outs and kind of the internal creative teams of what is given to you, or what you get from working with different teams. And so, again, not that any of these are good or bad. And certainly for organizations that maybe are looking to level up, it's like, okay, we did it ourselves, but now we really want to find a freelancer or a specialized designer to help us, refresh or build the brand, kind of freshen it up a little bit. Then that can be a great option for going from like DIY to looking a little more put together, and same with a small design firm or studio. So helpful to know what you're getting for these zeros. So let's start with freelancers. Freelancers are really cost effective. You're working one-on-one with an individual. And they may use pre-made elements like a Squarespace or a Wix, but be able to customize it a little bit more and give you more of that finished, polished feel. And it'll be a lower cost than hiring an agency, and you kind of have somebody that you can get in touch with when you need them. Now, the downside of that, they may not have the full depth of skills that like an agency has, a full creative team, creative strategy, a website strategist, and fewer resources. It's just them. So they may not always be available right away. And there might be limits to the scope or the complexity of projects that they can take on. So again, pros and cons, things to consider. I think freelancers work best for organizations that maybe you're growing, you may still be a one-person team, but you just really need a designer. You need somebody to like, hey, can I run this by you? Hey, can we, create a new web page? Kind of those one-off projects, but also someone who's just kind of keeping an eye on your brand. And I think of this as like a gun for hire type situation where it's like, okay, I know we're going to need a new landing page for Giving Tuesday or end of year. Let's have, Lauren work on that and send it over to her. And they can usually work a little more nimbly and a little more quickly. And then you build a relationship as you grow with your brand, which is really helpful that you build a relationship. Maybe they become a hire someday. Who knows?
One of the things too, that can make the difference between that, that 500 and 8,000, which is a big number there,
Yes.
is what they're starting from. So
Yes.
Lauren mentioned the idea of maybe they're starting from a Squarespace template. There's also, if you're using a system like WordPress or Drupal, you probably are you're using some system logically, that is probably you're not just these days you absolutely shouldn't be simply coding from scratch an
No.
HTML website. So something like WordPress, you have the option of either you can hire somebody who just does some tweaks
Mhm.
to a WordPress template that already exists to put in your colors, fonts, do a little bit. And that's going to be so what I just described, that's going to be very inexpensive.
Yeah.
And you might have a Jack Jill of all trades who can do that with the entirety of the website design. So they're not really that much of a graphic designer, but they
Yeah.
can do enough to kind of get a little bit in there and get a whole website up.
Yeah.
Um, or you can have somebody who can do a lot. They're going to be more expensive, but can do a lot with an existing template. Or you have some designers who will decline to ever use an existing template that they want, and this is more true of a firm or a studio, that
Mhm.
everything is always coded from scratch. That they afford on WordPress. WordPress is the most typical
Yeah.
platform for them to use. So they will say, okay, yes, I understand that you want to start from something. You don't care that deeply about it looking kind of templated. You want to do that for $1,000. I'm sorry, that's not something that we do.
Yeah.
So that's one of those things to kind of just have in mind as you're looking at people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great point. Great point. And I think for most freelancers, as you're leveling up, so to speak, like with a do-it-yourself, they're going to move beyond the do-it-yourself templates in many cases, or like Laura said, build it customized for you. So you're getting custom blocks or custom pieces that you may not be able to get with a DIY or a template. Great. So then moving up to small design firm or studio, like I said, this is what HeartSpark is. So I'm a little more familiar with it, but really with a firm or studio, you're getting a little bit of a bigger team and a little bit of a bigger team of experts. So again, if you're building a custom website, you're going to have a developer who's customizing those blocks, those pieces for you. And I know $5,000 to $20,000 is a big range. A lot of times, firms or studios will work with bigger websites. So it's a lot of, maybe there's a blog or a resource library or in WordPress looking to build something that your team can then take it and continue building. And so it's really you get a personalized like one-on-one feel. It's a smaller team. They can be nimble like a freelancer, but usually there's like specialized there's expertise. And so like branding, digital marketing, website design, user experience. So there's more of a strategic approach to the website as a whole and really kind of repositioning it, maybe even SEO. They kind of like Hertzberg's more of like a collective where we can bring in experts as needed for what your project needs. So that affects the overall budget. On the flip side, a lot of times it's a small team, so there's limited resources, capacity for large or complex projects. So this is like organizations that maybe are at the mid-size and looking to level up their website. Maybe their website's kind of grown a little bit beyond what they want and they want to tie it back in or like rein it back in a little bit. Then working with a small design firm or studio may be best for you. And a lot of times it's helpful if you have a smaller team to work with a small design firm. So that way there's like equal weight to opinions and factors and just thinking through how to run this website outside of the redesign process. And so with this, typically like when we do a website at HeartSpark, the $10,000 to $20,000 range includes copywriting, design concepts. We'll actually design custom web pages. So just like we talked about wireframes earlier, applying designs to the wireframes so that it feels like a custom experience for your website. And then developing that into WordPress so that way it's blocks that are editable. So you're not beholden to exactly what a template or something else, pre-designed templates have. So really trying to keep it flexible and build something that's unique for your team.
Yeah. Another thing, and there's a huge amount that is compelling about that. Another thing to think about for this particular kind of in the realm of a small studio is just understanding, in fact, on this whole page, understanding how each person defines website design in quotes. Because if you simply say you want a website designer, that could mean all sorts of different things.
Yes.
From literally, I want somebody to design an entire website. So I want someone to design and build an entire website for me, to I'm only going to get somebody who is going to do the look of the front end graphics, but I'm not going to implement it into anything. Or anything across, it could be they build it and they implement it, they work with a team to implement. So it's important to know. So there are small design firms who only do front end design, and that could mean front end graphic design, or that could mean the uh, the wireframes and the graphic design, but you might need to hire somebody else to do the development of the site.
Yeah.
So in fact, in both this and the first one, you'll also need to think about kind of project management,
Mhm.
time or costs. So if you're going to have different people doing different parts of your project, including perhaps yourself for some of it, you need to just account for the fact that somebody is going to have to manage that. And you have a little greater risk that if you have multiple contractors, they're going to point fingers at each other, or things are going to fall between the cracks.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And really, yeah, what is your team's capacity to keep communicating with the firm? Or in the case of like a small design firm or a large agency, they have project managers to communicate with you and keep the project going. So it's a little bit more hands off for you and your team, which is part of why that price goes up a little bit more. And so moving into larger agencies, advertising, marketing firms, these are full creative teams. And so, really, what's great is that this is like truly fully done for you, handled like the whole process from user experience design to graph design to web design to SEO, analytics, marketing. Like they can basically hold your website through the full project rather than just doing web design or maybe, web design and development. And so, what's helpful is they very much like care for and can handle huge websites and are very competent and confident in caring for you as the client. And so that's what's nice with a larger firm is that they will run the project from beginning to end and then also give you opportunities to like expand beyond that. So a lot of times with larger firms, these are bigger websites, bigger organizations that can handle that price tag because they're paying for the assurance of, a creative team to create something innovative, maybe award winning, and then also have integrations that are seamless and really building out that brand in ways that will be innovative and reflect on the organization and continue growing beyond beyond this current redesign. And so typically they'll have a custom platform that they're building on. It's not necessarily, sometimes it's WordPress, but usually it's a custom platform that maybe like a craft CMS or something like that, that they then build and customize the backend specifically for your nonprofit, which can be really beneficial if you have a marketing team or a marketing um, professionals that want something that they can track and be really active and engaged in updating over time. Now, the con, obviously, higher costs. There's usually also more processes and layers of internal creative expertise, which isn't necessarily a con. It's just the process can take a little bit longer. And so, again, there's none of these are better than another. It's just different ways to serve different size nonprofits and your specific needs. And so also wanted to talk really quickly about, volunteering or pro bono work can be great and can actually be activated in any of these three tiers. I've seen some design firms or agencies do pro bono work. I will say there can be cons to that as well. Like you might be on hold or waiting for their schedule to open up to work with them to get your project done. And then you kind of lose a little bit of leverage with pro bono work of like, okay, can I fully give feedback and really engage in this process since they're doing it for free? So it can get kind of awkward. I never encourage approaching someone asking for free work. Always, I think that was one of the questions we had earlier was knowing what that value is and being, really appreciative and kind of making sure it's not continuing to ask for free work, but maybe someone's offering to do it for free. I've done that when I was first getting started. To just, engage with nonprofits and help out. So there is that option. I will say it's very restricted. Like most marketing firms or studios will only take on one client like that a year. So it is helpful to, again, come to the process prepared and ready to engage at the right size for your organization.
Absolutely. So in regard to, and we're getting some great questions, we'll
Oh,
definitely
great.
be able to hit them all. I was just going to say, in regard to volunteers, technical volunteers in my actually fair amount of experience with this are very tricky in that they, as Lauren says, they're hard to rely upon because they kind of turn into a pumpkin because they have a higher priority. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm unless you have a deep personal relationship with somebody who is volunteering, I am nervous about recommending a volunteer for this kind of important work.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And knowing, whether they know nonprofit or not, I mean, there's a whole nother slew of factors to consider. Yeah, to consider with organizations, like really approach it cautiously. But if you find a great, freelance, like that's a great opportunity. And I know like when I was starting out, I redesigned a website and it turned into a paid opportunity. So there's definitely ways to still show appreciation and kind of continue growing that relationship. Okay, so last but not least, just want to cover again some of the things that we've talked about for finding the right design partner, whether you're doing it yourself or hiring it out. And so really, I think here are some basic steps you can take to prepare for your project and really get ahead. And honestly, by preparing, you're going to impress the designer or, whoever you're working with on your website design. Um, just that you've got your stuff together, which can be really important and really give them the confidence, like, okay, you're ready for this, and this is going to be a good engagement. So there's really no downside to preparing ahead. First, always recommend planning for your project internally. So define the goals, budget, timeline with your team. Decide if you need branding or other pieces that would be helpful to develop along with a website. Um, Sometimes it's like, nope, we're good. We have our logo. It was just designed, it's approved. But sometimes it's like, I think we do need some other elements, and your team is going to know that better than anyone. And again, it's important to be upfront with that with your designer or vendor, whoever you're working with, of what you're looking for, what would be most helpful for your team to take and continue using. I think it's also helpful to know the number of directions and iterations. So if you say you have your brand already designed, you might not need three design options or concepts. You might only need one, and that's going to save you time and money too. And then the number of revisions. So most designers, like our team, typically provides 2 rounds of revisions with design and writing. And so if you know your team is going to be more choosy or more opinionated, it's helpful to let them know, we probably are going to need 3 or 4, or, we're going to have a lot of people weighing in, and being upfront about that will be really helpful. And your designer will probably tell you, like, okay, then we need to have consolidated feedback and really have a clear hierarchy of feedback that we're getting. So again, it's just a combination of knowing what you need and collaborating with the right partner for your organization. And then also internal stakeholders. What is your internal review process? What do you want it to look like? It can be really exhausting if you're fielding emails from everybody. So maybe you have a bi-weekly meeting or a standing meeting that's just talking about this project, keeping it moving forward, and then how many people need to be involved in giving feedback. And sometimes it's just you and one other person, and that's fine. But it's also helpful to know, okay, this is going to have to go to the board at some point just to keep them in the loop. Or, we do want an advisory council or somebody to help weigh in on the website as we're developing it. Again, just helpful to know that along the way. And then also make a short list of partners, whether it's, some pre-made templates, there's lots of options available to you, or, a design firm or a freelancer or an agency who's out there. And that can be a quick Google search, or if there's a consultant that you love working with, ask them. I'm sure they have a network of people or a community that they can kind of tap and see, okay, who could be the best fit for this client that I love working with. So you feel free to ask around, and you can consider all of the different pros and cons. And yeah, and then finally review portfolios. So before you contact someone, review portfolio, see if there's that quality, creativity. Is their style similar to what you're looking for? And do they have examples of their work, of similar websites designed the same size as your organization? And so look for style that aligns with your mission, vision, what you see, inspiration that you're pulling for your organization. Okay. And last but not least, some Q&A. We still got a little bit of time. But again, just want to say the more prepared you can be for your design project, the better fit you're going to find for it. So really thinking about it internally, having those discussions internally will help you prepare. And then also budgeting ahead, thinking like, okay, this is about what we can spend or what we can budget for, 2025, and being upfront about that. I think there's no shame in being clear about what you need. And, even if you meet with a creative team or a design firm and they're like, oh, we're not really good fit, they'll probably recommend you to somebody who might be. So again, just understanding what drives those design costs, and hopefully this will help you make a better budget conscious decision for next year.
Fabulous. And we do in fact have some good questions already.
Yay.
But this is now it's a great time to put more questions into the chat if you have them. So here's a really interesting question, and I'm going to answer it myself, and then I'm also going to ask Lauren to answer it, because I think that there is interesting perspectives on this from both a strategy and a graphic design perspective.
Yep.
So how do you create a design for your current audience and your goal audience, since sometimes they don't match up? So that's an excellent question. And I would add to that, you're, you may, you could well have multiple audiences and those don't match up. So for instance, it's very common to have, all right, legislators are an important audience for my site because we're doing legislative advocacy, but we're also working with low income folks. And those are kind of different audiences. And so the answer is to try to find the overlaps, to try to find a way that a kind of a language to speak both graphically and non-graphically that will speak to them all. Lauren, what would you say to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so my first thought actually went to the strategy side of things, Laura, where I was like, hire someone like Laura to help you navigate on specifically related to website. How do you direct people to those different areas of the site or those different user paths? Like I think of the homepage as kind of the place that you can start guiding people where they need to go. And I think it's okay to have design, like your overall brand should encompass both. And so that's where I think your brand needs to speak to your mission, your values, your attributes, like who are you? And then that's where your images, icons, illustrations can speak to those different audiences. And so if your current audience, I always think like with website, you want to attract the audience, like your goal audience. And so, like at HeartSpark, when we were transitioning from, serving small businesses, at that point I was freelancing to HeartSpark, I wanted to attract nonprofits. Then all of the information on my website attracted that goal audience. And so, really, you can keep speaking to your current audience and showing up for them, but your website I think of as more outward facing, or you can have those different paths. And that's where you can use images, copy, and illustrations or icons to help direct people to the right area for them, if that makes sense. I hope that answers your question. That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Want to go back to Brianne's a question all the way at the beginning about the kind of the potential value of her volunteer work for building a site in GoDaddy. So it's a little hard to know without knowing the scale and kind of what you did in terms of content writing and graphic design and stuff like that. I'd say it's probably at least $1,000 or two, and
Yes.
probably not dramatically, unless there's a bunch of pages and you did a bunch of content writing, probably not dramatically more, just in that you were able to implement it in GoDaddy, which
Yeah.
has some limitations.
Yeah, same. Like so tip when I did volunteer work, I always track my time because I want to beat the clock. So that's like my own nerdiness. So what you could do from here is, think about how much time did it take? So you could track it by time, which it sounds like maybe you haven't tracked the time, like the hours that it's taken to put together. But I think a general range would definitely be like in that 2 to 3, maybe 4,000 mark. But you can also look at how many pages is the website? Did you create custom graphics for any of the pages? And again, it's just an estimate just to let maybe for tax purposes or for letting them know. But I would start tracking your time and just, paying attention to that. It's one for your own mental health and balance too. So it's not getting requests all the time and feeling like you have to answer them, but just, offering, a certain number of hours or maybe something like that to kind of help balance it if it's becoming out of control. But I would say, yeah, it depends on the size of the site. And then building in GoDaddy seems a little more custom. I'm not too familiar with that, but if you used a pre-designed template or not can affect the price too.
Fantastic. We've got two more questions at the moment. You can try putting more in. So we've got two questions from Andy, and I'm going to actually ask them in the opposite order. What options do smaller nonprofits have for getting graphic design support either on a monthly retainer or even more sporadic than that? I'm just going to turn that to you, Lauren.
That's a great question. Your best solution there is probably with a freelancer. And so I know that there's sites like Design Pickle and different services available where you can pay for a retainer to get graphic design services. You may not get the same designer every time, and then there's not really that relationship you're growing with the individual designer. So I would, for a retainer for graphic design service, I would probably say a freelancer is your best bet, which for instance, I work with it's a little bit different, but a copy editor, proofreader on Upwork, and I've worked with her for years. And so we have a relationship where I'll send her links to things. Hey, can you take a look at this? So it could be something like that too, where you find a great freelancer on Upwork, and continue to work with them and build that relationship. But there's also, I think Consultants for Good is a great resource, and I'm sure there are network groups, or feel free to email me afterward. I can connect you with some freelance groups too.
Yes, and Consultants for Good is a great call there. There's a directory there. Just to describe very quickly, Fiverr and Upwork, for those who don't know them, they're both sites in which you post a specific project and get bids, and often from people all over the world, and you can choose who you want to look at.
Yeah.
Lastly, I'll answer this one myself in 1 minute and then let you wrap it up, Lauren. So how do you avoid a nonprofit staff, Jack, Jill of all trades, opting to use AI image generation for new web content, even when the result is design that is uninspiring or just sloppy? And I'm going to assume that you don't have actual authority over them to tell them
Yeah.
to cut it out. So I feel like having a good repository of photos is a great step here, and I'll as I mentioned, I'll send that out. There's also some pretty decent stock photo sites.
Mhm.
So for instance, Pexel I'm putting in is
Yeah.
a decent one. Uh,
Unsplash is another great one.
Upsplash. Um, to try to offer them options to go instead. I agree that you need to be actually really good at AI image generation in order to do it, to get good stuff. And it is it's very resource intensive in terms of carbon footprint, creating images, we go through 10 to get one, and it's burning a lot of fossil fuel in, somebody's servers. So it's not the greatest way to go. That would be another way to go about it, is to look that information and to provide that fact that AI image generation there's a lot of, kind of negative things about it. All right, with that answer, I'm going to turn it over to you, Lauren, for the grand finale of the seminar.
Well, I really appreciate y'all joining us today. And here's some options to connect with me. I share a lot of free resources on my website. You can also email me if there's any questions today, or if something sparked an idea and you're like, oh, I'd like to know more about that. Send me an email. I run HeartSpark, so I'm always checking my email and happy to answer any questions. Or if you're like, I think it's time for us to refresh our website or just refresh our brand, schedule a call and you'll meet with me and we'll talk about where you're at, what are your current challenges, and can, yeah, figure out the next best step for you. And I also am connected to a lot of great consultants like Laura and a few communities. So happy to reach out to them and see if there's any good fits there. So thank you for having me today. This has been so fun. I love talking all things design. I hope it was really helpful as you plan ahead for your website and just consider all of the options. But have a great day, and thanks for having me, Laura. This was fun.
Fabulous. Thanks so much for doing this, Lauren. And
Yes.
thank you all for coming. I'll hope to see you again at another seminar soon.
Awesome. Have a good day, everybody.